Undercover boss orders toast at neighborhood cafe, freezes when waitress says tips don't cover bills. Early in the morning, before the sun had risen high, the warm yellow light inside the small cafe, nestled in the neighborhood, still sparkled like a promise of a peaceful day. The smell of freshly toasted bread blended with the aroma of ground coffee, painting a familiar picture of rushed mornings where regulars stop by for a moment of peace in the hustle and bustle of life. At the far corner of the cafe, under the warm yellow glow of a vintage-style hanging lamp, Michael Foster, 50-year-old CEO of the neighborhood cafe chain, who had once poured his heart into building this place as a second home for his staff, sat quietly like any ordinary customer. No name tag, no authoritative smile, just a man searching for himself in the suspicious eyes of the young people busily working. His eyes swept over every corner of the cafe, the wall clock, with its slow-ticking second hand, the steaming cup of coffee, the droplets of water glistening on the glass like sweat on a server's brow. Everything still felt familiar still. The place he had once called the home of trust and fairness. Lily's gentle footsteps, the young waitress, cut through Michael's train of thought. The yellow light highlighted the beads of sweat on her weary forehead. Her hands trembled as she placed a tray of toasted bread on the table, a moment as seemingly ordinary as the thousands he had witnessed before in his cafe. But this time Lily's eyes glistened with silent exhaustion. Her voice trembled as if she were trying to hold back tears. "Tips here aren't enough for me to pay my monthly bills." That sentence dropped onto the table like a knife, piercing Michael's heart. It exposed a harsh truth he had never thought possible, right inside the very place he had built with his own hands, the place he had fully believed in as a haven of fairness, where he had once thought every staff member was treated with respect and had a peaceful place to call home. Michael's eyes darkened. His hand trembled, his fingers tightening around the coffee cup, handle a subconscious reflex of someone trying to hold back a wave of anger, disappointment, and the pangs of guilt rising in his chest. The yellow light illuminated his face, highlighting every wrinkle, every crow's foot etched deep by the years of sacrifice and effort he had poured into making Neighborhood Cafe not just a coffee shop, but a second home for so many. At that very moment, a cleaning staff member inadvertently passed by holding a soaked mop. His footsteps sounded softly on the gray tiled floor. His absent-minded gaze and voice came out as light as a sigh, but enough to crush any remaining glimmer of hope. "Here, the ones who work the hardest are always the ones who get the least." Michael froze. That sentence was like a mirror, reflecting everything. Trust had been betrayed, fairness had been distorted, and the sweat of young people like Lily was still falling silently and alone onto the cold tile floor. Under the pale yellow light cast by the old lamp, Michael knew the place he once believed was a second home had now become a house of forgotten tears. And that was precisely the moment that marked the beginning of an irreversible journey. A CEO standing amidst his own dream, and that dream was being shattered by the hands of traitors, by a tip-sharing system he'd been so proud of, now turned into a nightmare that devoured the hopes of so many. Michael Foster, 50 years old, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes holding the depth of a man who had once poured his heart into building Neighborhood Cafe into a brand of trust and fairness. Over the years, he had always believed that every cup of coffee, every plate of warm toast served here was not just a product of a cafe, but the culmination of humanity, of sharing, and of a bigger dream to make this place a second home for hard-working people. That morning's sunlight streamed through the old glass, casting shimmering patterns on the worn gray tiles. Neighborhood Cafe, a small cafe nestled on a quiet street corner, still retained its warm, familiar charm. The scent of freshly toasted bread wafted in the air, mingling with the rich aroma of ground coffee, like an invitation for customers to pause amid the rush of life. It was once the place Michael proudly showed his friends, saying, "Here, fairness isn't just a slogan, it's something every employee can take home at the end of every shift." But lately, the cafe had not been the same. Revenue had dropped. Staff were quitting, one after another. Customers complained about the quality of service, about the staff's attitude, about the smiles that had disappeared. Rumors about unfair tip distribution spread through every corner of the cafe, seeping into every glance, every resigned shake of the head. Some former employees sent anonymous messages to Michael, saying that he needed to see for himself what was happening. Michael had always believed that the tip-sharing system at Neighborhood Cafe was the most transparent a place, where fairness was ensured and trust was nurtured every day. Yet those rumors had suffocated that trust like a smoldering flame, burning away his ideals. "I have to see it with my own eyes," he thought, And that was why this morning Michael decided to disguise himself as a customer. No CEO name tag, no authoritative look, just himself. A man who had once believed in his dream, now stepping into his own brainchild with wary eyes and a heavy heart. He sat in the corner of the cafe where the pale yellow light cast down on the worn wooden table. A steaming cup of milk coffee, a freshly toasted piece of bread, crispy and warm. Michael looked around the cafe, the small tables, the fogged-up window panes, the staff bustling with food and drink. Every step of the staff, every glance, they avoided each other's eyes. Everything seemed to be whispering a story he knew he had to hear. Outside, the morning sunlight was still gentle, but inside Michael, a silent storm was brewing. He knew that only the truth, no matter how painful, could save the second home he had once poured his heart into building. Michael sat silently in the corner of the cafe, the warm yellow light reflecting off his hair, now streaked with gray. The aroma of freshly toasted bread mingled with the steam from his hot milk coffee, evoking sweet memories of the early days of building Neighborhood Cafe. But this morning that fragrance no longer warmed his heart. It only left a bitter taste at the back of his throat, like a warning of an approaching storm. From his vantage point, Michael noticed the young waitress, a youthful face, eyes shadowed with fatigue and exhaustion. Her uniform no longer crisp like the others who were favored. She moved slowly, her eyes occasionally scanning the cafe, as if searching for something she had lost. She was always assigned to the slow shifts, with only a few customers quietly enjoying their morning coffee. The meager tips barely covered a simple meal. The yellow light cast down on her face, highlighting the dark circles beneath her eyes, signs of sleepless nights and countless worries. Michael looked up as she brought the tray of toast and placed it in front of him. Her hands trembled, the tray shaking so much the toast nearly fell over. He gently asked about her, his voice low but tender, the voice of someone who once proudly called this place a second home for young people like her. She lowered her head, her voice choking as if she had to summon every ounce of courage to speak. "The tips here aren't enough for me to even cover my monthly bills." A sentence that seemed so simple, yet it pierced straight into Michael's heart like a dagger. He remembered the old days when he himself used to share out every tip fairly, seeing the light of hope in his employees' eyes, the belief that fairness still existed, that hard work would be rewarded. And now, with just a few words, that fragile hope had been laid bare, as a cruel truth, that dream had been betrayed. At that moment, a janitor pushing a mop bucket walked past. He glanced at Michael and uttered a cold, quiet sentence that chilled Michael to the bone. "Here, the ones who work the hardest are the ones who get cheated the most." Those words were like a mirror reflecting a harsh reality. A reality Michael had once thought would never exist in this place. His eyes darkened. In that moment, the bright memories of Neighborhood Cafe, of those early days when he stood behind the toast counter sharing out tips with the eyes of a father who believed in fairness, all of it seemed to shatter. His heart ached, each beat like a silent scream, like a question he couldn't avoid. Did I really let this happen? Michael knew that this very moment was the turning point of everything. He could no longer just sit there believing that things would get better on their own. Because behind every piece of toast and every cup of coffee, there were the sweat and tears of those who had once called this place their second home. And now he had to be the one to stand up and reclaim that trust, or his dream would completely collapse. Michael leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands folded on the table, his eyes still fixed on Lily, the young waitress fumbling with the tray of toast. Her sigh drifted softly, almost merging with the warmth of the milk coffee he hadn't yet tasted. In that warm yellow light, Michael suddenly noticed her trembling hands, her thin fingers marked with calluses, the evidence of countless days of quiet, futile labor. He tried to stay calm, but inside him, his emotions surged like a hidden tide. In his mind's eye, he saw the mornings of years ago when the cafe was small, when every tip was distributed right in front of everyone, when he stood there proud, happy to see the grateful eyes of each staff member. But now all those memories seemed to be covered in a thin layer of dust, making him feel like a stranger lost among the very dream he had created. At that moment, Lily clenched her hands around the tray of bread, her voice trembling, as if that sentence was the last thing left to hold on to, a final attempt to grasp a thread of hope. "The tips here aren't enough for me to even pay my monthly bills." Her voice cracked and then fell silent like a midnight wind that had just died. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He looked directly into her eyes, eyes like a dry lake, weary and hollow. In that moment, he realized this girl had been fighting too long in silence, resisting a system he himself had once promised would always be fair. And now she was standing alone in the storm. Michael felt the whole cafe freeze. The post machine suddenly beeped, a cold, sharp sound like an alarm revealing a hidden truth. The entire cafe was enveloped in a suffocating silence. In that instant, an elderly janitor walked past his shoulders, stooped from countless night shifts. His voice low as a breeze, but as sharp as a knife to Michael's chest. Here the ones who work the hardest are the ones who get cheated the most. Michael felt the whole room sway. Every word from Lily and the janitor felt like nails driven into his heart. The yellow light blurred in his eyes, or was it the tears threatening to spill? In that moment he looked at every face in the cafe, every pair of eyes cast downward, every thin shoulder bowed before the bread counter, every drop of sweat, silently falling onto the cold tile floor. And he wondered, in all those years building the neighborhood cafe empire, had he ever taken his eyes off the light of justice, allowing darkness to creep in and steal the hope from the very people he had promised to protect. His eyes darkened, then slowly lifted the eyes of a founder, confronting the deepest wound in his own heart. Michael took a deep breath, his chest swelling as if to swallow all the air in the stifled room. He knew just one more step, and there'd be no turning back. But he also knew this was the moment to choose between fear and justice. And if he didn't stand up today, tomorrow, no one would ever believe in the promise he had once made between cups of coffee, between midnight tears. His heart pounded. His lips were dry, but he knew this moment would mark the beginning of a new journey. A journey to reclaim the dream of fairness that had been tarnished by greed and cowardice. With a determination burning in his chest, Michael clenched his hand around the coffee cup, his eyes blazing with the fire of belief. I won't let this happen again. And in that golden light, Neighborhood Cafe still breathed, still quietly hoped, like the very breath of the people here waiting for him to rise and rewrite justice with his own heart. Michael sat silently in the space he had once cherished like his own child. The gentle yellow light cast down on his hair, highlighting the creases left by years of devotion. The coffee had long gone cold, but the bitterness in his heart surged. He inhaled deeply, his gaze sweeping across every corner of the cafe, where every brick, every table had been placed with all his heart. Now those very places were harboring shadows he had never imagined. He noticed a group of young employees' uniforms, crisp black shoes, gleaming eyes, shining with confidence and arrogance. They walked through the cafe with the air of people who knew for sure that the rewards were already in their hands. Every glance, every tilted smile of theirs was like a secret code that only those on the inside could understand. Michael watched them in silence, his heart heavy. Those employees were always assigned the busiest shifts, where tips flowed like water. They had grown wealthy off the sweat of others, the very thing he had once sworn would never happen under the roof of Neighborhood Cafe. Meanwhile, in a corner of the cafe, Lily worked quietly, her hair matted with sweat. Her hands trembled as she collected the leftover toast plates, wiping away every drop of coffee that had spilled on the counter. The yellow light fell on her face, a face etched with the sadness of someone used to standing outside of every sweet sharing. Michael saw the dark circles under her eyes, marks of sleepless nights of worries about making ends meet that weighed heavy on her shoulders. She was always given the slow shifts, where tips were so meager they could barely get her through the day. Michael clenched his hand, his knuckles white. His eyes stopped at the POS counter, where the cool green glow from the computer screen reflected on the frost-cold face of a young employee. The boy's fingers danced across the screen like a pianist. Every beep of the POS felt like a knife slicing through Michael's trust. He saw every tip amount appear and then vanish as if that green glow was swallowing every drop of sweat and tears from people like Lily. That's when he discovered that the POS had been tampered with. A group of managers and their close-knit staff had secretly altered the tips, turning the money that should have gone to the rightful employees into their own personal rewards. A cruel sleight of hand suffocating the dream of fairness he had worked so hard to build. Pain swelled in his chest, the pain of a founder watching the very values he had nurtured betrayed by the people he had once trusted. Michael remembered the early days. Back then, he personally divided the tips for the staff, and their eyes shone like stars, the eyes of people who believed that if they worked hard, every drop of sweat would be fairly rewarded. That light was gone now. In its place was a haze of fear that he could read in Lily's eyes every time she stole a glance at the POS, where just one click could snuff out hope. He knew Lily had been secretly recording everything. Those small sheets of paper, the trembling numbers, the threatening messages, she kept hidden like silent cries for help that couldn't be spoken out loud. Michael pictured her tiny hands trembling as she wrote, her eyes darting around the cafe like a thief of light, terrified of being found out, terrified of losing the only job that kept her afloat. Michael bowed his head, his heart heavy with responsibility. In that moment, he heard his own heartbeat, each thump as heavy as an accusation. Did I let this happen? The yellow light shone on his face, revealing every wrinkle, the marks of sleepless nights spent worrying over building a fair. and humane neighborhood cafe. He knew this wasn't just a fight against a rigged POS system. It was a battle to reclaim the trust that had once been given to him with all their hope. And Michael knew just one decision, just one click, could rekindle the flame of justice, reignite the dream he had once poured his whole heart into building. Michael took a deep breath, as if to steady himself against the silent storm rising in his chest. His eyes swept over every corner of the cafe. Every table, every painting on the wall bore the imprint of the passion he had once poured into it. And yet now it all seemed like a stage for self-serving performances, where trust had been traded for cold mechanical clicks on the lifeless POS machine. He looked up at Lily, the yellow light cast on her face, highlighting the exhaustion etched into her features, her small hands still diligently wiping down tables, as if she were trying to brush away the invisible dust that had settled on hope itself. Every time her eyes flicked to the POS, Michael saw a fear that couldn't be put into words, a fear of being exposed, of being crushed under the weight of injustice. In that moment, Michael knew he could no longer remain silent. He suddenly remembered the cafe's very first staff meeting, where he had stood among them, a tips ledger in hand, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Every tip is your sweat. Here, fairness isn't a slogan, it's my promise." That voice now echoed in Michael's mind like a wake-up call. A memory flashed through him, those eyes sparkling with hope back then, those genuine smiles when they received their first tips from his hands. All of them seemed to be watching him now, placing their trust in him, and he knew that if he did nothing, he would betray those very eyes. He watched every movement of the close-knit staff group carefully. They didn't know his eyes were following every gesture, every conspiratorial glance they exchanged. Michael noticed how they seized the moment the POS closed out the shift to quickly make edits, the pale green glow on their faces, highlighting their cold expressions. The same faces that once smiled and called him boss now had become betrayers of his trust. Michael's heart tightened. He remembered the sleepless nights, the early mornings standing behind the toast counter, handing out tips to smiling employees. He remembered customers' well wishes, the small but inspiring stories they shared. And yet now, a single group had managed to shatter it all. He imagined Lily, her small hands trembling as she wrote down every missing tip, her eyes shining with a loneliness Michael had never seen before. A young woman too afraid to speak out, but brave enough to preserve a fragile piece of hope. Michael knew that if he didn't act, that girl and countless others would remain forever, as tiny specks of light snuffed out under the greedy hands of those who had betrayed trust. Michael stood up, the yellow light shining on his face, casting his shadow on the worn-out tiles, like the marks of time itself. He took a deep breath, his eyes blazing with determination. "No, I won't let this continue." He knew that just one decision, just one click, could rekindle the flame of fairness he had once proudly ignited. And at that very moment, Michael decided he would stand up, face it, and win back the trust, the dream he had once poured his whole heart into building. Amidst a busy morning, the golden light from the overhead lamps shone down like sunlight glistening on the coffee bar. Michael Foster stood up, his posture straight, his graying hair catching the glow, the face of a founder who had once poured his whole heart into making this place a second home for so many employees. His steps were heavy but resolute, echoing like a wake-up call in the thick air. He raised high a stack of evidence sheets imprinted with adjusted tip figures, unfair shift schedules, threatening messages to employees like a mirror, reflecting all the lies that management had caused. The yellow light shone on each line, highlighting the sweat and tears of those who had silently endured for so long. His face was tense, his eyes glowing with the fire of truth. His voice rang out firm, deep but steady, each word like an arrow piercing the wall of deceit. "This is your sweat and tears stolen by these managers. From today on, every tip will go to the one who deserves it." The whole cafe seemed to freeze. The clinking of cups stopped, the hurried footsteps halted, leaving behind a silence so thick it felt suffocating. The green glow from the POS screen, the light Michael had once believed symbolized transparency, now shone directly on the manager's face, who was staring down. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, glistening like the tear of a man exposed. His shoulders shook, his eyes darted around, looking for an escape, but there was none. Michael turned his gaze to Lily. That young girl who once stood by his table, voice trembling as she spoke of tips that couldn't even cover her bills, now looked up. Her eyes shimmered with tears, but they were no longer tears of helplessness or resignation, but tears of a faith finally given its rightful name, justice. The golden light bathed her face, turning her into a beacon of hope for all those who had remained silent in the darkness. Michael felt his heart beating fast in sync with the breath of those standing around him, those who had once called this place their second home. He knew this moment was not just about confrontation and unmasking, but also a promise to himself and to all those who had placed their trust here. Fairness was not just a slogan on paper, but something real, in every drop of sweat, every laugh, and now finally named. That morning sunlight still streamed through the windows of Neighborhood Cafe, filtering through the leaves outside, casting warm rays on the old tiled floor. Michael stood quietly watching Lily, the young girl, now wearing the shift manager's uniform, her eyes gleaming with confidence, her voice stronger than ever. She was instructing new employees how to serve, toast, how to brew coffee, each step a testament to one thing: that every effort deserves to be recognized. Lily, who once bowed her head, hiding tears over meager tips over long anxious nights, had now become a symbol of resilience and fairness. A bright smile lit up her face, the warm glow from the ceiling lamp adding a gentle halo, an image Michael knew he would never forget. He looked around the cafe and saw the hopeful eyes of the employees, the very hope he had once ignited with his own heart. Now everyone could make a living, no longer having to scrape by for every penny, no longer worrying about going hungry or eating leftovers. A transparent tip-sharing policy was implemented, a small sign placed at the counter explaining the meaning of tips to customers, just a single click on the POS, just one short meeting, and the entire system changed. Michael stood there, the golden light shining on his face, revealing the crow's feet earned through years of dedication. He thought to himself, one teardrop changed an entire system, and as he walked out the door, looking back at his brainchild, a sense of pride swelled in his chest. Fairness doesn't live in revenue reports, but in how you treat the people who have poured their sweat and tears into building this place.